Simon Cowell built his reputation in a world that rewards certainty. His face became synonymous with blunt honesty, sharp criticism, and an ability to define success or failure in a single moment. For millions watching talent shows, he wasn't just a judge, he was a symbol of finality. A raised eyebrow could crush confidence, a small nod could launch careers. That level of authority shaped how the world saw him, as someone almost immune to emotional disruption. But what the public never truly saw was the separation between that persona and the man behind it. Away from the stage lights and studio audiences, Simon lived in a quieter space that was far more uncertain and human than his television image suggested. His life had always been structured around control. Control of format, control of timing, control of outcomes. Yet life itself does not respect structure, and eventually, something entered his world that no production system could manage or edit. Fatherhood arrived not as a planned chapter, but as a transformation that redefined everything he thought he knew about stability. It did not erase his career or diminish his identity in entertainment. Instead, it quietly shifted the center of gravity in his life. The man who once evaluated talent in seconds found himself learning something far more complex: how to simply observe without judgment, how to wait without conclusion, and how to love without conditions. This shift did not happen in headlines or interviews. It happened in silence, in daily moments, in private adjustments that no camera ever captured. The most decisive transformation in Simon Cowell's life was not professional, it was emotional, and it began in a place far removed from fame. The Valentine's Day that became a beginning instead of a moment. February 14, 2014 is remembered publicly as the birth of Eric Philip Cowell, but for Simon, it represented something far deeper than a date on a calendar. It was not just the arrival of a child, it was the collapse of an old identity and the beginning of an entirely new one. For years, Simon had spoken openly about not expecting to become a father. He framed it as certainty rather than hesitation, describing himself as someone too settled in his ways to accommodate the unpredictability of raising a child. His life was already built, in his mind, around independence and professional pursuit. There was no space for interruption. But emotional certainty often dissolves when confronted with lived reality. The moment he saw the scan of Eric, something shifted internally in a way he could not articulate. It was not rational, not planned, and not influenced by external expectation. It was instinctive. He later described it as a form of emotional recognition he did not expect to experience again after the loss of his parents. The arrival of Eric did not simply introduce fatherhood, it introduced legacy. Naming his son after his father created a connection between generations, linking past grief with present hope. In that decision alone, Simon's emotional world began to expand beyond the boundaries he had previously set for himself. Fatherhood, in that moment, stopped being an abstract concept. It became immediate, irreversible, and deeply personal. And with it came a responsibility that no professional achievement had ever required: emotional presence without performance. Early childhood and the subtle signs that could not be ignored. The early years of Eric's life were filled with ordinary parental experiences, growth, discovery, adaptation. But within those ordinary moments, Simon began noticing details that did not fully align with expectations he had unconsciously formed based on other children. These were not dramatic signs, they were subtle patterns. Moments of extended silence, differences in response to noise, variations in social engagement that seemed more internal than expressive. At first, they were easy to dismiss as part of natural developmental variation. However, Simon's instinct was not shaped like that of most parents. His professional life had trained him to detect nuance quickly. He had spent decades identifying small differences in performance, tone, and presence. That same observational skill began to activate in a different emotional context. By the time Eric reached key developmental milestones, language progression had not followed the expected trajectory. While other children experimented with speech and vocal expression, Eric remained quieter, more observational, and more internally focused. Simon did not interpret this immediately as concern in a clinical sense. Instead, it became a question, one that lingered rather than demanded immediate answers. He began to pay closer attention, not out of fear, but out of curiosity mixed with protective instinct. What made this phase particularly complex was the gap between external reassurance and internal awareness. Others suggested patience and variability. Simon understood that logic, but emotionally he sensed a different kind of developmental rhythm unfolding, one that did not follow conventional timelines. A father who stopped judging and started observing. As Eric grew, Simon's approach to understanding him began to change fundamentally. The instinct to judge, so central to his professional identity, gradually softened into something more observational and less conclusive. Instead of interpreting behavior as right or wrong, he began asking a different kind of question. What does this mean for Eric's experience of the world? That shift may sound simple, but for someone whose entire career depended on immediate evaluation, it was profound. He began noticing that Eric processed environments differently. Loud spaces were not just stimulating, they could be overwhelming. Routine changes were not minor disruptions. They could alter emotional balance. These patterns required adaptation not from Eric alone, but from the environment around him. This realization shifted responsibility in a new direction. Rather than expecting Eric to adapt to the world, Simon began adapting the world to Eric. Home environments were adjusted. Schedules became more structured. Predictability replaced spontaneity in many aspects of daily life. At the same time, Simon noticed strengths that were equally important. Eric displayed deep focus, strong observational awareness, and a unique internal logic in how he engaged with objects and patterns. These qualities did not fit traditional expectations but were meaningful in their own right. Fatherhood, at this stage, stopped being about direction and started becoming about alignment, aligning the world with the child, rather than the child with the world. The vacation that revealed everything without saying a word. The turning point came during a family vacation when Eric was 4 years old. What was intended as a relaxed, joyful experience quickly became a moment of clarity that could not be ignored. New environments introduced unfamiliar sensory experiences, noise, movement, unpredictability. For Eric, these changes were not minor adjustments but overwhelming shifts in perception. One evening, during a family meal surrounded by sound and activity, Eric reached a point of sensory overload. He covered his ears, withdrew inward, and became visibly distressed in a way that could not be soothed by simple reassurance. For Simon, this moment was not confusion, it was recognition. The patterns he had observed suddenly aligned into something clearer. That night, the decision was made to seek professional guidance, not because Eric was seen as broken, but because understanding had become necessary for meaningful support. It was a decision rooted in responsibility rather than fear. From that moment, the journey changed direction. Observation became structured evaluation. Private concern became professional consultation. And uncertainty began to shift toward clarity, even if that clarity carried emotional weight. The decision that turned uncertainty into action. After the vacation incident, something irreversible shifted inside Simon Cowell. Until that moment, he had been living in a space between observation and denial, aware that something was different, but not yet fully committed to naming it or defining it. That night changed the balance. It was no longer about wondering, it was about understanding. The decision to seek professional evaluation was not made in panic, but in clarity. Simon had always been decisive in his professional life, and now that same decisiveness was being redirected into fatherhood. He and Lauren agreed that Eric deserved support rooted in understanding, not assumptions. What followed was a structured process of observation and assessment. Specialists studied Eric's communication patterns, sensory responses, and developmental behavior. But for Simon, the experience was not clinical, it was deeply personal. Every question asked about Eric felt like a window into a world he was still learning to interpret. The goal was never to label Eric in a limiting way, it was to understand how he experienced reality. That distinction mattered deeply to Simon, even before any formal diagnosis was given. He was not searching for a category, he was searching for clarity. This phase marked the beginning of emotional adjustment. Uncertainty was no longer passive, it became active engagement. And with that came a new kind of responsibility, one that required patience, openness, and emotional endurance. The words that changed everything without changing who he was. When the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder was eventually confirmed in December 2018, The moment did not arrive with shock in the dramatic sense. Instead, it arrived with quiet inevitability. Simon had already sensed that Eric experienced the world differently. The diagnosis simply gave structure to what had already been observed. The specialists were careful in their language. They did not describe limitation, they described difference. They explained that Eric's development followed a unique pattern of communication, sensory processing, and interaction. And within that explanation was something important. Potential was not absent, it was simply expressed differently. For Simon, the most important word in that moment was not autism, it was understanding. Because understanding meant possibility, it meant support, it meant direction without restriction. He asked one question that reflected both vulnerability and hope. What does this mean for his future? The answer did not focus on restriction. It focused on adaptation, learning, and support systems that could help Eric thrive in his own way. That framing changed everything. It replaced fear with structure. It replaced uncertainty with direction. And most importantly, it replaced judgment with acceptance. From that moment onward, Eric was not seen through the lens of comparison, but through the lens of individuality. A home rebuilt around understanding instead of expectation. After the diagnosis, life at home began to change in ways both visible and invisible. Simon did not try to reshape Eric. Instead, he reshaped the environment around him. The home became less about flexibility and more about predictability. Lights were softened, noise was reduced, routines were structured. Spaces were redesigned not for appearance, but for emotional comfort. Every adjustment carried one purpose: to reduce unnecessary stress and increase stability. This transformation was not immediate. It evolved gradually as Simon learned what worked and what did not. He began to understand that even small environmental changes could have significant emotional impact. Daily life became carefully structured. Therapy sessions were integrated into schedules. Transitions between activities were planned rather than spontaneous. Even social interactions required thoughtful preparation. What might have seemed restrictive from the outside was, in reality, supportive. Structure created freedom, not in a traditional sense, but in the sense that it allowed Eric to engage with the world without overwhelm. For Simon, this required a shift in mindset. Spontaneity had once been part of his identity. Now, planning became an act of care. The emotional cost of letting go of an imagined future. One of the most difficult aspects of Simon's journey was not the diagnosis itself, but the quiet grief that followed it. It was not grief for Eric, but for the imagined version of fatherhood he had unconsciously carried. He had once envisioned simple milestones, teaching Eric to ride a bike, having spontaneous conversations, sharing unstructured moments of ease. These were not demands, but expectations shaped by cultural assumptions of parenting. As reality unfolded differently, Simon had to let go of those expectations. That process was not dramatic. It was gradual and deeply internal. Grief in this context did not mean loss of love. It meant transformation of expectation. It meant accepting that some imagined moments might never happen in the way they were once pictured. But within that letting go, something else began to form. A different kind of fatherhood emerged, one based not on prediction, but on presence. Instead of measuring what was missing, Simon began valuing what was present. Small moments of connection became meaningful in ways that traditional milestones never could. A world that watched without understanding the full story. While all of this was unfolding privately, the public world continued to observe from a distance. As Eric appeared in occasional public moments, speculation naturally followed. Some comments were kind, others misinformed, many incomplete. Simon became increasingly aware that public perception rarely reflects private reality. What the world saw were fragments, moments without context. When photos or clips circulated, they were interpreted without understanding the environment, preparation, or emotional considerations behind them. This created a gap between lived experience and external narrative. At first, Simon chose silence. He believed privacy protected Eric. But over time, silence began to feel insufficient as speculation grew. The challenge was not visibility, it was misinterpretation. And protecting Eric meant deciding when to remain private and when to correct misunderstanding. This tension between public life and private truth became one of the most delicate aspects of their journey. speaking out and redefining protection in public life. Eventually, there came a moment when silence was no longer enough. When misleading narratives began to circulate more widely, Simon made a decision he had long avoided. He spoke publicly about Eric's diagnosis. The message was simple but important. Eric was autistic, he was loved, and he was happy. There was no attempt to dramatize or over-explain. The goal was clarity, not attention. The response was mixed. Many people expressed understanding and support. Others continued to speculate. But something important shifted. Eric was no longer an unknown subject of curiosity. He was a child whose experience had been acknowledged with dignity. For Simon, speaking out was not about visibility. It was about protection. It was about reframing the narrative from speculation to respect. Yet even this decision carried complexity. Greater awareness meant greater attention. And greater attention meant greater responsibility to maintain boundaries. Protection, he realized, was not a single action. It was an ongoing balance, redefining success in a life no longer measured by applause. As time passed, Simon's definition of success began to shift in ways that could not be reversed. In his professional world, success had always been external. Ratings, reactions, recognition. In his personal life, success became internal and quiet. A calm day, a smooth transition, a moment of understanding between father and son. These were no longer small things, they became everything. He began to see that progress did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes it was invisible to anyone outside the immediate experience. This reframing changed how he approached both work and life. Professional achievements no longer overshadowed personal presence. Success became less about scale and more about meaning. And in that shift, something profound occurred. The pressure to perform gave way to the responsibility to be present. The beginning of a different kind of fatherhood. As Simon continued adjusting to this new reality, he began to realize that fatherhood was not a role he could define in advance. It was something he had to continuously learn, adapt to, and evolve within. There were no fixed rules, no universal guide, only experience, observation, and emotional responsiveness. Eric was not a project to be shaped. He was a person to be understood. And that understanding required patience that extended far beyond traditional expectations of parenting. This realization marked the beginning of a deeper transformation. Simon was no longer simply a public figure adapting to fatherhood. He was a father reshaping his identity around understanding another human being's unique way of existing in the world. And that shift, once begun, could not be undone. Learning to read a language without words. As time passed, Simon Cowell began to understand something that no career in television had ever prepared him for. Communication does not always depend on words. With Eric, meaning often existed in silence, in gesture, in repetition, and in patterns that required patience to decode rather than immediate interpretation. At first, this was unfamiliar territory. Simon had spent decades listening for vocal precision, verbal confidence, and spoken performance. His entire professional judgment system was built around language. But fatherhood forced him to expand that definition entirely. He began noticing that Eric expressed himself in ways that were consistent but subtle. A shift in focus, a repeated action, a preference for certain routines, all of these became forms of communication. What might have once been dismissed as behavior now carried meaning. This shift required slowing down. It required observation without interruption. Instead of reacting immediately, Simon learned to wait, to watch, and to interpret over time. That patience became one of the most important emotional skills of his life. In this silent language between them, something powerful developed: trust. Eric did not need to adapt to external expectations of communication. Instead, Simon entered Eric's rhythm, learning to understand him on his own terms. It was not fast, and it was not easy. But it was real. And in that reality, their connection deepened in ways words could never fully describe. The emotional weight of unspoken understanding. As Simon grew more attuned to Eric's world, he also began to experience a deeper emotional awareness. One that came not from explanation, but from observation. There were moments of joy, but also moments of quiet emotional complexity that no one outside their world could fully see. He began to understand that parenting Eric was not about fixing or changing anything. It was about acceptance in its most complete form. That acceptance carried both relief and emotional weight. Relief, because it removed uncertainty. Weight, because it required letting go of expectations that had once felt natural. There were days when progress felt visible and encouraging. And there were days when challenges required patience that stretched beyond comfort. Through it all, Simon remained present, even when understanding took time. What made this experience so emotionally layered was its invisibility to the outside world. Public appearances showed only fragments. The real journey unfolded in private, in quiet routines, in repeated learning, and in emotional adjustment that never paused. And in that space, Simon discovered something unexpected. Vulnerability was not weakness, it was connection. The more open he became to uncertainty, the more deeply he understood Eric's world. The quiet transformation of a public identity. While Simon's private life was undergoing profound change, his public identity remained largely unchanged in appearance. He still appeared in professional roles, still participated in television projects, still carried the image the world recognized. But internally, something had shifted permanently. The priorities that once defined his decisions were no longer absolute. Work was no longer the center of everything. It was one part of a much larger emotional structure. This created a dual existence. In public, he remained the confident, decisive figure audiences knew. In private, he was a father learning daily how to adapt, understand, and support a child with a different way of experiencing the world. Balancing these two identities required emotional discipline. It required knowing what to share and what to protect. It required maintaining boundaries that were not always visible to others. Over time, this balance became more natural. The separation between public persona and private life grew clearer, not because of distance, but because of understanding. Simon was no longer defined solely by judgment or production success. He was defined by something quieter, something deeper, something that could not be measured in ratings or headlines. The pressure of being under constant public observation. As awareness of Eric's life slowly entered public discussion, Simon became increasingly aware of the pressures that come with visibility. Even small moments could be interpreted, discussed, and amplified beyond their original context. This created a tension that many public figures experience, but few can fully escape. Every appearance carried meaning beyond intention. Every image carried interpretation beyond reality. For Simon, this was particularly sensitive because it involved his child. What might have been simple family moments became subject to speculation, commentary, and analysis from people who did not have full context. This was not something he could control entirely, but he could control how much access the world had to Eric's private life. That control became an important protective boundary. He became more deliberate about exposure, more careful about participation in public narratives involving his family. The goal was not secrecy, but preservation of normalcy in an environment that rarely allows it. Through this, Simon learned that protection is not passive. It is active, ongoing, and often invisible to those outside the situation. A moment that redefined silence into responsibility. There came a point when silence itself became a decision that needed to be reconsidered. As speculation about Eric continued in public spaces, Simon realized that silence alone was no longer protecting him, it was allowing misunderstanding to grow unchecked. The decision to speak publicly did not come easily. It came after careful thought, emotional weighing, and a deep consideration of what would serve Eric best. When he eventually addressed the situation, he did so with clarity rather than detail. He acknowledged Eric's autism, emphasized love and support, and requested privacy rather than attention. It was not a statement designed for impact. It was a statement designed for clarity. The response that followed revealed something important about public perception. Many people responded with understanding, empathy, and shared experience. Others misunderstood or continued speculation. But for Simon, the purpose had been fulfilled. The narrative had been corrected enough to protect Eric's dignity in public space. Still, the experience reinforced a difficult truth. Visibility always carries consequences, even when handled carefully. Redefining fatherhood through acceptance rather than expectation. As time continued, Simon's understanding of fatherhood evolved into something more grounded and less defined by external comparison. He no longer measured himself against traditional expectations of parenting. Instead, he focused on what Eric needed specifically. This required letting go of assumptions, letting go of imagined milestones, letting go of comparisons to other children or other families. In their place came something more stable: acceptance. Not passive acceptance, but active, thoughtful, engaged acceptance. This meant meeting Eric where he was emotionally, developmentally, and socially, rather than where external expectations suggested he should be. It also meant recognizing progress in forms that might not be immediately visible to others. A moment of calm, a successful transition, a new form of interaction. These became meaningful markers of growth, not because they were large, but because they were real. And in that shift, fatherhood became less about shaping outcomes and more about supporting experience. The quiet strength that replaced public recognition. One of the most significant internal changes Simon experienced was a redefinition of strength. In his professional world, strength had always been associated with confidence, control, and decisiveness. In fatherhood, strength became something quieter. It became patience during uncertainty. It became presence during difficulty. It became emotional steadiness in moments without clear answers. This form of strength did not generate applause. It did not appear in headlines, but it became the foundation of everything he was building at home. Over time, Simon realized that some of the most important forms of resilience are invisible to the outside world. They are lived rather than observed. And in that realization, his understanding of himself began to shift permanently. He was no longer only the judge the world recognized. He was also a father shaped by experience that no stage could replicate.